and welcome to episode 68 of Toke Signals TV, where we bring you the biggest in cannabis and hemp news stories every week. I'm Steve Elliott, the editor at TokeSignals.com, and I'll be guiding you through the news. First, let's look at our Toke Signals bud pick of the week. We have some Grape Ape indica here for you. This was flowered 8.5 weeks somewhere in Washington, and as you can see, to spectacular results. Let's do the news now, shall we? Huge news from the federal government. They have announced they won't stop Native Americans from growing and selling marijuana on tribal lands. This is an epochal shift likely to change the face of American society forever. The Federal Department of Justice on Thursday told U.S. attorneys not to prevent Native American tribes from growing or selling marijuana on their sovereign lands, even in states where cannabis is illegal. This new memorandum will offer guidance which will be implemented on a case-by-case basis, according to U.S. Attorney Timothy Purdon from North Dakota, chairman of the Attorney General's Subcommittee on Native American Issues. Tribes must still follow the 8 guidelines or areas of concern offered by the federal government after Colorado and Washington voters chose to legalize marijuana in the 2012 elections. The federal guidelines will also apply in Oregon and Alaska, where voters chose to join the ranks of legal states in 2014. Now, it's still unknown just how many reservations will take advantage of this new policy, but it seems likely that many of them will, judging by the proliferation of tribal casinos. Many tribes, however, remain opposed to legalizing marijuana on their lands, and federal officials will continue to enforce the law in those areas if requested. The new policy comes on the heels of a 2013 Justice Department decision to stop most federal marijuana prosecutions in states that have legalized cannabis. Voters in Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, and the District of Columbia have all chosen to legalize cannabis, but the law in D.C. may be blocked or scaled back by a paternalistic GOP-controlled Congress. Many tribes see marijuana sales as a potentially lucrative source of income, similar to tobacco sales and casino gambling, which have fattened the coffers of tribes across the nation. Others, though, including the Yakama Nation in Washington state, remain strongly opposed to the sale or even the use of marijuana on their lands, despite the fact that it's now legal at the state level. According to Purdon, many, perhaps a majority, of Native American tribes, scarred by the painful legacy of alcohol abuse in their communities, appear to at least initially oppose allowing marijuana use and cultivation on their territory. One Arizona tribe has even gone so far as to seize the vehicles of medical marijuana patients who happen to get stopped while driving through their reservation while holding weed. The DOJ will generally not attempt to enforce federal marijuana laws on federally recognized tribes that choose to allow cannabis as long as they meet the 8 federal guidelines, including that marijuana not be sold to minors and not transported to areas that ban it. The tribes have the sovereign right to set the code on their reservations, Purdon said. Also in the United States this week, more big news where Congress prohibited the Department of Justice from undermining state medical marijuana laws. The final must-pass federal spending bill that Congress will consider this week, also known as the Cromnibus and released by senior appropriators Tuesday night, includes an amendment that prohibits the U.S. Justice Department from spending any money to undermine state medical marijuana laws. The spending bill also includes a bipartisan amendment that prohibits the Drug Enforcement Administration from blocking implementation of a federal law passed last year by Congress that allows hemp cultivation for academic and agricultural research purposes in states that allow it. It also contains an amendment blocking marijuana law reform in Washington, D.C., although it is unclear what exactly the amendment blocks. For the first time, Congress is letting states set their own medical marijuana and hemp policies, a huge step forward for sensible drug policy, said Bill Piper, director of the Drug Policy Alliance's Office of National Affairs. States will continue to reform their marijuana laws, and Congress will be forced to accommodate them, Piper said. It's not a question of if, but when federal marijuana prohibition will be repealed. This is a great day for patients and for public safety, according to Major Neil Franklin, retired Executive Director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Congress has finally listened to the vast majority of Americans who believe the federal government has no right to interfere in the personal decision to use medical marijuana made by a patient in consultation with his or her doctor. Law enforcement never should have been a part of that decision, and if this amendment passes, they no longer will. Now, back in May, 219 members of the U.S. House of Representatives voted for a bipartisan amendment that was sponsored by Republican Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, Democrat Congressman Sam Farr, and 10 other members of Congress, prohibiting the DEA from undermining medical marijuana laws in 23 states, as well as 11 additional states that regulate CBD oils. Senator Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, and Senator Cory Booker, Democrat of New Jersey, introduced a similar amendment in the Senate, but a vote by the Senate on the amendment was never held. The House amendment made it onto the final appropriations bill, marking the first time Congress has ever cut off funding to marijuana enforcement. Another House amendment, sponsored by Republican Congressman Thomas Massie and Democrat Congressman Earl Blumenauer, prohibiting the DEA from undermining a federal law that allows industrial hemp research under certain circumstances, also made it into the final appropriation bill. Now, it's unclear if the funding bill blocks the nation's capital in its efforts to legalize marijuana. Initiative 71 passed on November 4th, with 70% of voters approving the measure to legalize small amounts of marijuana for personal use. And that leads us right into our next story, which is, in D.C., marijuana legalization can proceed, according to an emerging consensus. Republicans were successful in including language in the omnibus federal spending bill that interferes with the right of Washington, D.C. to set its own marijuana policies. That language, however, was not what the GOP originally wanted, because they had to compromise with the Democrats. The D.C. marijuana rider inserted in the bill allows D.C.'s marijuana decriminalization law, passed earlier this year, to stand, while prohibiting D.C. from taxing and regulating marijuana like alcohol. A D.C. Council committee recently approved tax and regulate legislation, and it's widely believed that the council will legalize, tax, and regulate marijuana next year, if it can. Because the language was poorly drafted, there has been disagreement over whether or not the spending bill rider would overturn Initiative 71, an initiative approved by 70% of D.C. voters in November that legalizes marijuana possession and home cultivation for personal use. Based on statements by members of Congress, including members who were part of funding bill negotiations, it's clear that the legislative intent of the rider was to allow both decrim and Initiative 71 to stand, while blocking D.C. from carrying out more sweeping reforms in the future. Initiative 71 was enacted on November 4th when 70% of D.C. voters approved it, said Bill Piper, Director of National Affairs for the Drug Policy Alliance. Voters wanted to reduce racial disparities in the criminal justice system and focus police resources on serious and violent crime. The will of the people should stand, Piper said. In Nevada this week, we learned that marijuana legalization will be on the 2016 ballot. Nevada's Secretary of State, Ross Miller, on Monday approved an official petition to add marijuana legalization to the ballot for November 2016. The Coalition to Regulate Marijuana Like Alcohol needed to file 102,000 signatures. They ultimately filed about 200,000, almost twice the amount they needed. If passed, the measure would establish marijuana cultivation and distribution businesses, as well as legalize adult possession of up to an ounce in Nevada. Nevada joins an ever-growing list of states with marijuana legalization on the 2016 ballot, said Major Neil Franklin from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Marijuana prohibition has put countless otherwise innocent people in jail and increased street violence, just as alcohol prohibition did in the 1920s, according to Franklin. Nevada is ready to prioritize public safety, and we look forward to seeing their state and others responsibly regulate marijuana so that law enforcement can focus on more pressing crimes. In Colorado, more signs of progress this week as they okayed a marijuana credit union. That's right, marijuana businesses in Colorado have plenty of cash flowing in, but until now they've had a difficult time finding somewhere to put it. Most banks still refuse to work with marijuana businesses because they fear enforcement of federal banking laws. Cannabis is, of course, illegal at the federal level. Now a new credit union designed specifically for the legal marijuana industry hopes to offer a solution. It's called the Fourth Corner Credit Union, and they plan to open within 2 weeks in Denver, offering to accept cash deposits and to allow members to make electronic cash transfers for payroll and rent and to buy supplies. We are on the 1-yard line, said attorney Mark Mason, who is advising the credit union's 9 founders. Banking regulators in Colorado granted Fourth Corner a charter on November 19th, and now the union is waiting for the Federal Reserve to issue it a master account number, which would give it access to the U.S. electronic banking system. The credit union's organizers believe it will get the number without a fight because the Federal Reserve is required to give out numbers to organizations that have already been granted state charters. But despite the illegal status of cannabis at the federal level, Colorado's banking regulators said they are respecting their state's laws by approving Fourth Corner. The credit union still needs insurance from the National Credit Union Administration and to sign a lease prior to opening. I'm a pro-states' rights guy, and in Colorado we have legalized, said Chris Michaelbust, Commissioner of Financial Services in Colorado. When I pull a $20 bill out of my pocket and look at the front, it says it's legal tender for all debts, public and private. Legal businesses in a state should be able to use the currency of the nation, Michaelbust said. In Oregon this week, lawmakers approved money for legal marijuana rules. The Oregon Liquor Control Commission can now begin the implementation of recreational marijuana legalization in Oregon under Measure 91 after the legislature's emergency board, composed of state, House, and Senate members, approved funding for staff, legal help, and rule writing. The board approved a $583,000 loan for the OLCC. That money's coming from the state's liquor taxes, with the promise that the commission will pay it back by the end of 2015-2017 budget cycle using revenue generated by marijuana sales. This money will allow commissioners to hire 4 workers, a program manager, 2 policy analysts, and a public affairs staffer. Regulating recreational marijuana in Oregon might eventually require up to 30 employees, according to one state estimate. Oregon voters approved Measure 91 with a lopsided 56% to 44% margin last month, but the ballot initiative left most regulation up to the Liquor Control Commission to work out by January 2016. Homegrown marijuana and personal possession will become formally legal on July 1st, 2015, with commercial sales of pot expected to begin in 2016. The agency is to decide where cannabis can be grown and sold, how it should be labeled, and whether to allow medical marijuana growers and dispensaries to participate in this recreational industry. In Alabama this week, the FDA has given approval for a marijuana oil study. The Federal Food and Drug Administration has given the University of Alabama at Birmingham the go-ahead to study the use of cannabidiol, a marijuana derivative, to treat seizures. The university on Wednesday received FDA letters authorizing 2 studies, one for children, one for adults, according to UAB spokesman Bob Shepard. Parents of children with severe seizure disorders convinced the Alabama legislature last year to pass a bill authorizing UAB's Department of Neurology to perform a study of cannabidiol, CBD, a non-psychoactive component of marijuana. Shepard said the FDA had requested some changes in the studies. Those will go before a university review board next month, he said. It's hard to put into words the feelings you have as a dad with a daughter that could benefit from this, said Dustin Chandler. The legislation had become known as Carly's Law after Chandler's 3-year-old daughter, who started having seizures at just 8 weeks old. Carly was eventually diagnosed with the rare genetic disorder CDKL5. Chandler, a police officer in Pelham, Alabama, frequently appeared before the legislature to advocate for the bill. Alabama lawmakers unanimously approved the study after a decriminalization bill failed. That legislation would have shielded parents and patients from prosecution if they bought the oil on their own. Its failure was attributed to opposition to any form of medicinal marijuana in Alabama. The approved legislation gives $1 million to UAB to fund the 5-year study. Patients in the study who are prescribed the marijuana oil will be protected from state criminal charges. That's it until we come back with more news next week. Until then, stay lifted. See you then.